Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Okay, so that's enough by way of announcements. Today our topic is human enhancement. How far should we go? A very topical topic, I have to say, in terms of what comes out in the news almost every week these days. We have a very distinguished panel to discuss this topic this afternoon, and I'd like to introduce them to you. On my far left is Dr. Anders Sandberg, who's the Senior Research Fellow in the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford. And then next to me here on my left is Dr. Georgia Testa, who's lecturer in medical ethics at the University of Leeds. On my immediate right is Dr. Peter Moore, who's a science communicator. He's also author of the book Enhancing the Hope and the Hype of Human Enhancement, which I think is on our bookstall, I believe as well afterwards. And then on my far right is Professor John Wyatt, Professor of Ethics and Perinatology at University College London, and is also author of a book entitled Matters of Life and Death. So we're very grateful to our panel for coming along today and sharing their thoughts with us. The kind of format for this afternoon will be that I'm going to, in a moment, ask Anders if he'd like to give us, as it were, the case for enhancement in just a few minutes. And then I'm going to ask John Wyatt on my right for the case against enhancement in a few minutes. Then we'll have the other panel members who will join in and give their own particular thoughts. And there'll be a little bit of panel discussion, but within certainly 25 minutes we'll be throwing open the discussion to the floor and seeking questions and answers from the floor and discussion in that way. So we're not just going to sit here and discuss amongst ourselves. We'll be glad to hear for the rest of the afternoon. Okay, so that's the format. So I'm going to hand over then to Anders to kick us off. He's got a microphone. I'm going to remind the panel to keep the handheld mic close to the mouth so that you can all hear what's being said. Thank you, Anders. Over to you.
Thank you, Denis, and I think this seems to be close enough. Okay, a few minutes improvisation about why I think we should be enhancing ourselves. I think we could go back to the year 1215 or whereabouts, where there was an interesting debate about a new drug that had arrived. The location was in Mecca, and the Arab scholars and the priests were debating this coffee. Should we ban it, because the Quran clearly bans the use of alcoholic beverages, or should we be using it because it seems to be keeping people awake? And on one hand, there were several people who, including one of the caliphs, I forgot his name unfortunately right now, I obviously need more coffee myself, who argued this is like alcohol, throw them into jail if we drink that coffee stuff. And then of course a lot of scholars writing a lot of essays as well as poems, lauding the amazing power of this thing that allows us to think more clearly, to do better allows work. And I think that is a bit the debate we're still having, especially about cognition-enhancing drugs. We have various ways of improving our thinking. Education, for example, it's supposed to give us 2.7 IQ points per year up to some limit, then it levels off, unfortunately. It would be so good if it just kept on going. It turns out that we can improve our memory quite a lot by memory training. Various kinds. So we can memorize whole phone books if we actually care to use these techniques. But there are new techniques coming out. We see in the media a lot about cognition-enhancing drugs, originally intended to treat various diseases, but they also work in healthy people and might help you learn things a little bit better, focus attention, or affect the mood in different ways. And of course, in the future, we might be having much better technologies and a better understanding of how we can modify our minds and our bodies. We already have various animal models, for example, of enhanced memory, where we genetically can modify mice, so they, in different respects, improve their memory. And we have certainly a long list of other ways we can enhance mice. We can definitely make super mice today that can run faster and live longer and have better memories and even shine in the dark if you shine a UV light at them. That ought to be possible, at least in theory, that you could do it to a human. Except, of course, that most parents care too much about the safety of the children, so we're not going to try that unless we can be really, really certain this is really safe. And I think in general, there is a good reason to do enhancement, and that is we want to improve human well-being. Why do we want health? Well, it's not because health itself is good. It's because health allows us to live a rich life. And we want our different life projects to go well. But most of these life projects are very, very different from each other. Some like to create art, others want to experience natural beauty, some want to do political change. But things like intelligence, health, a long lifespan, that's very useful for practically all life projects. There are very few life projects that are helped by becoming sick. There are few life projects that are helped by becoming forgetful. So I think that is the real reason we want to enhance ourselves. And to go back again a little bit in history, Pico della Mirandola, the Renaissance scholar, in his Oration on the Dignity of Man, which is also a kind of pro-enhancement manifesto, but this time from the 16th century, where he is arguing that this new high-tech called alchemy should be allowed to Christians to use. And he is essentially arguing that, well, God gave all different animals certain properties, but humans got just one amazing property. We can change ourselves. That is what it is to be human. And I think enhancing ourselves, using our different kind of technologies and institutions to make ourselves better by whatever measure that better is, because that's something we're always going to have very different views on. That is deeply part of the human condition. So that's, I guess, my very quick start of why we should be enhancing, and why we probably should want to enhance ourselves a lot and far.
And there's one question, in a sentence, one sentence, how do we define enhancement in your view?
I think there are two levels of enhancement. One is taking the natural function of something in our bodies and the minds and kind of pushing it so it does that function better. On the other hand, we might also want to add something new. As an example, memory is about retaining information from the past and maybe being able to make use of it in the future. So by enhancing memory, we would become better at doing that, which doesn't necessarily mean remembering everything. And similarly, we might want to have some new sense. For example, a friend of mine told he's got an implanted magnet, so he can sense magnetic fields. He's got a kind of extended perception. He can now sense a realm of reality we normally can't experience at all.
Thank you very much indeed. So what?
So you may not have realised that we're all sitting in a geographically important direction, and I am the, so we start out at extreme pro-enhancement to sort of moderate pro-enhancement through to moderate anti. So I'm the extreme right. So I'm framed as the guy who's totally against it, or what is sometimes called the neo-Luddite, the Luddites who Anyway, I'm not really like that. I want to say I'm not anti-science, I'm not anti-technology, I'm not anti-progress. I've spent most of my life working as a consultant in neonatology, which is a very high-tech kind of medicine at University College London. I've also worked as a research scientist and have actually contributed towards high-tech developments in the care of the newborn. So I'm not at all against progress. I do think that this word enhancement is a very slippery word, and it is often used in a very overgeneralized way. So it is often said that education is a form of enhancement, and that the use of tools is all part of enhancement, and that medical aids like spectacles and hearing aids, they're all enhancement. So what's the difference? What's the difference? What's wrong with, we're all doing enhancement anyway. So I think it's not helpful to overgeneralize the term. I think what we really should be discussing is the development of what I would think is non-species typical behaviour, either function or structures. So to live to 100 years actually is not enhancement, because there have always been people who've lived to 100 years, although they've been relatively rare. To live to 200 years would be non-species typical. That would be to do something that is new. Similarly, to have an IQ of 150 is not particularly special. There have always been people with high IQs. That's what men's society is all about. To have an IQ of 250, again, would be non-species typical. And it would be to somehow change the design. So that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about changing the human species. And it's often said, oh, well, we'll just give the choice. People have choice. We don't want to force anybody. It's just all about autonomy. But that's also very slippery. I mean, we have total choice in the world, across the world, in the soft drinks that we we have complete autonomy. So isn't it surprising that so many people drink Coca-Cola? But that, of course, illustrates that autonomy is influenced by social conditioning, by marketing, by consumerism, and so on. And I'm afraid there's already a great deal of consumerism in terms of enhancing our bodies. So the whole cosmetic surgery industry, there are now millions and millions of pounds. Young women, for instance, in particular, are spending huge sums of money in order to end up with a very strange figure, to end up with a very long hair, small nose, huge breasts, tiny hips and waist. And we spend thousands of pounds in order to look like that. Why on earth look like that? Because it's a male fantasy. It's a sort of porn fantasy of how women would like to be. And so now, because of that male fantasy, women are changing their bodies into this rather strange, from a medical point of view, abnormal body image. So it's consumerism applied to the human structure. But there's also something actually deeper. There's a huge philosophical problem about autonomy, because this concept of autonomy is profoundly dualistic. In other words, there's some kind of inner mystical self who makes decisions about my own body. I choose how to make my body. But what is this self? What is this choosing self? And the answer is, according to the dominant materialistic neuroscience, this choosing self is simply an epiphenomenon of my cortex. There is no self. It's simply my body making an illusion of a choice about how to make my body go. So what if we could change people so they always wanted to choose in socially acceptable ways? Would that be a good enhancement? Or is that kind of choice not really choice at all? It does seem to me that underlying this trend for enhancement is really what I would call techno-selfishness. It is amazingly egocentric. It's some very bright people wanting to be even brighter, wanting to be even stronger, and so on. And there's a sort of arrogance about it, a bit like the Mensa Society, all saying, we're all terribly bright, and now aren't we terribly nice people? We want more people to be terribly nice and bright like us. Whereas, actually, faster, stronger, brighter does not necessarily mean morally better. We all know bright people who are nasty and malevolent. And in fact, some of the most transparently good and virtuous people that I know are not clever, and they're not beautiful, and they're not strong, but they are the kind of human being I actually want to become. So I think we need to ask, what I want to say is that ultimately, human enhancement is morally ambiguous. It isn't necessarily the way that the human being wants to go. It may be, but sometimes it can be downright destructive. So is techno-selfishness contributing to the common good? And if you take, just for instance, take two technically sophisticated people, would it be better that we took someone like Bill Gates as our role model, or we took Ray Kurzweil? Which of those two people do we actually feel is a better role model for technologically sophisticated people? If we talk about the issue of justice in technology, the global trade in organ trafficking is already, there's empirical evidence to show that organs are moving across the world, and they are moving from poor bodies into rich bodies, they're moving from weak bodies into strong bodies, and they're moving from female bodies into male bodies. And as C.S. Lewis said, man's power over nature turns out to be power exerted by some men over other men. So yes, I'm in favour of science, technology, human progress, but technical enhancement is morally ambiguous at best and socially destructive at worst. We need a better vision for humanity, not faster, stronger, brighter. Let's find ways of encouraging human beings to be more virtuous, more wise, more prudent, and more concerned for the weak, the poor, and the vulnerable.
Thank you very much, John. So, Giorgio, what is it to be?
Okay, I'm going to try and very briefly address the points that John has raised, but they will be very brief. So, first of all, the issue that John raised was we should think about enhancement as doing something that's non-species typical. And we should be concerned about doing those kinds of things that alter what seem to be essential to the human race. But my question posed in reply is, what's normative about those kinds of ordinary species-typical characteristics? There's a common distinction that's made in philosophy. It's called the is-ought gap. Just because something is the case, it doesn't mean to say that it ought to be the case. So just because we're used to humans having a certain range of abilities, it doesn't follow that that, from a moral point of view, sets what our abilities should be. And so it doesn't follow that it's obviously wrong to try and change that. Now, as Anders said, some of the things that people who work in enhancement or argue for the idea of enhancement look to are those kinds of things that can improve human life. So, Anders talked about all-purpose means, things like improved intelligence maybe, or maybe improved health. Maybe we can talk about living slightly longer lives with better health. Maybe we can talk about being stronger. These are the kinds of skills and abilities that could improve the lives of most people. So why wouldn't we want these all-purpose means? I mean, after all, John raised the point that there seems something very odd if we sort of think about intelligence of people with an IQ of 250. Now, I would urge you to try and resist that thought. It seems unusual to us. But in what sense would the world be worse rather than different if we could enhance everyone to have an IQ of 250? I mean, just think about the richer experience we could all potentially have. And not just the more things we can invent. I mean, the quality, the intrinsic quality of our lives could be improved, as well as, if you like, getting more stuff or doing more things. So it might be different, and we might not be able to imagine what it would be like, but it wouldn't obviously be bad. But I think a very important point on one of the reservations that I have is about the justice of these kinds of things. So the concern would be, if we develop technologies that can enhance people, then we're feeding very much into a consumerist culture. People wanting to change themselves in ways that we now consider to be socially desirable. And I think the deeper objection that John also mentioned is that to do with justice. I think one of the problems could be, if we developed enhancement technologies, they will be subject to market constraints, or if like market demands. So what would happen is that those who could afford them would get them. And so that would seem to push against the current trend that we have, not just within our countries, but on a global scale, to try and narrow the gap between the advantaged and the disadvantaged. Now, we might well be able to deal with that within a particular country by saying, okay, well, these are the kinds of advances that are not obviously wrong in themselves, but they're going to affect people's lives in a way that seems contrary to justice, create an even more advantaged class with a greater relative gap between the abilities of the advantaged and the disadvantaged. So maybe we'll recognise as a requirement of justice within our societies that somehow we provide this to everyone. Now, I doubt whether the will would be there to do that. But even if we did that within our own countries, to try and ensure that we didn't widen that gap between the advantaged and the disadvantaged, think about the effect on the rest of the world. We are not very good at transferring financial resources to the third world. How willing would we be to extend our technology to them when it would be to our extraordinary advantage not to do so? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Enhancement. So, yeah, Peter.
Hi. I come at this as a science writer, author, journalist, and my involvement in the enhancement debate started when the Science Museum asked me to write a book about human enhancement. And it became called Human Enhancement, and then Hype or Hope. And as I went around doing the work for the book, I went around and I started by meeting people who had, I was told, enhancing technologies applied into them. So I bumped into the longest living person with an artificial heart. He was adamant that he wasn't enhanced. He called himself a cyborg, but he didn't feel enhanced. He was very ill. I met a chap with magnets in his fingers. It was a great little toy, but difficult to find from him anything that actually he'd discovered from doing it. His fingers buzzed occasionally when he was standing near light bulbs, and he could tell when he was programming on his computer whether the hard drive was whizzing. I can do that by listening. Kevin Wyatt put transponders in him that are similar to the cat flap that you can get, that your cat walks along and its flap opens and enables cat can't open. And what we need to do is to check out how much hype is being attached to some of these things which we talked about as enhancement. I talked about having a hyperscope. One of the things about a hyperscope is it goes off when people say if. And there's a bit of mythology comes in. When you find 4 ifs in a sentence, just multiply them each time. Within that, coffee is an interesting one. So your coffee comes in, and the first time you have it, it bumps you up. And then you need it in order to operate at the normal level, without letting you down. Education levels off. The cognitive enhancement drugs will take people who are operating at a bad level and move them up. If you've got someone who's operating at a high level, what it'll do is it'll squeeze your imagination as it increases your focus. The mice with their memory enhancement became highly paranoid. Actually, forgetfulness is wonderful. Ask anyone with PSTD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't want infinite memory. Selective forgetfulness is really wonderful. Now, maybe we can have an enhanced ability to select our forgetfulness. So, as I was writing, I thought there's a few things, and it sort of reflected around the panel that's important. You have to look at, sorry, I have to remember, I'm not enhancement. Are we talking a social enhancement? Are we talking a person enhancement? Are we talking a species enhancement? If you muddle those 3, then you can have a really waste of time, because they're completely different territories. Many other things we're talking about are personal enhancements. They can make me as an individual operate better, but it hasn't changed the human species. And when I went through, there's lots of evidence for social enhancement, personal enhancement. These things do strange things to our ability, but it hasn't changed the species. And I can't see much that is changing that. So, I'll stop there at the moment and see, but just listen out for ifs and see where we go on this.
Hang on for a minute. So, thank you very much, Nate. Yeah, my mind is still worrying about this paranoid mice, and how do we know mice are paranoid? Anyway, maybe we should get there, so it's a different discussion. So,
It's looking for a cat.
Right, now we know. Okay. So, now, does anyone want to come back? Anders, you should have first choice. Do you want to come back at some of the points that have been made, or just pick up a few points?
Some of it.
Yes.
And of course, yes, cats really should worry about paranoid super mice with fluorescent powers. One interesting thing about these little gadgets is also that they're a good demonstration that not all technologies diffuse equally. Cell phones are spreading across Africa long before we got landlines over there. And the reason is, of course, these gadgets, although they're amazingly advanced, well, they're mass-produced and they become cheap gadgets. And I think a lot of enhancement can become very, very cheap. The really tricky enhancement, the ones where we might worry about the social impact, are those that require somebody who is a skilled professional to administer them. If life extension treatment require you to go to an enhancement spa where people recode your DNA or so, then they're never going to be cheap until we can replace the doctors and nurses with robots, because the cost will always include their salaries. If you could get the pill doing the same thing, then the cost could come down and we could probably figure out some nice solution that would improve justice. I also think that talking about species enhancement is tricky because, well, we don't really know whether we have one species or whether it's even a value in remaining one species. We might want to actually deliberately go in a lot of different directions. That still doesn't mean we can do anything we like to, because there are a lot of moral constraints. The real trick is, of course, to figure out what kind of enhancement actually work pretty well and is cost effective. Giving people iodine, for example, in the as a supplement to the salt. That seems to be one of the best ways of getting more intelligence into the world. It's very, very cheap, and there are large parts of Asia where people are iodine deficient. That's not necessarily an enhancement, but you have society where a large population have slightly iodine deficient. So if we actually got that iodine, you would get an average increase of IQ across the whole society. And the interesting thing economists have discovered is that improving intelligence, well, it's slightly good for an individual, but it seems to be much better when the whole society gets slightly smarter. Through education, better nutrition, or actually biological interventions.
Right, it's going to just pick up also the is-ought point was picked up. So, John, do you want to go to is-ought, and then we'll come back to perhaps Georgia. Yes.
Thanks. Yes, Georgia mentioned this well-known philosophical principle. I think Hume was one of the first ones to say that you can't get an ought from an is. So just because human beings are like this doesn't mean they ought to be like this. Now, that distinction is often used by philosophers, but it underlying that is a fundamental philosophical presupposition or a worldview. And what it is, underlying that the is-ought distinction, is that there is no fundamental purpose or meaning behind reality. That ultimately it's a materialistic or naturalistic narrative that says the whole of reality is purposeless. There is no underlying purpose or direction or meaning, and therefore, because there is no purpose or meaning, you can't get an ought from an is. But of course, many of us, including myself, don't accept that fundamental presupposition. There is a different way of looking at the world, of saying that actually there is a purpose and a meaning behind the universe, and therefore there is a purpose and a meaning in our own human identity, in our own human structure. And so, for instance, within many religious perspectives, for instance, in the Christian and the Jewish religions and in the Muslim religions as well, human beings are regarded as, in some sense, made in the image of God. That in some sense, our structure reflects some other reality. And that part of our human distinctiveness and our intrinsic value as human beings is independent of our functioning. What's special about human beings is not that we have opposable thumbs, or that we're bipedal, or that we have a certain cortical function. No, what's special is intrinsic to our human identity. Incidentally, that's where human rights come from historically. Human rights, the fact that every human being on the planet has value, actually comes from this idea that there is something intrinsic in our human structure. So the is-ought distinction is often raised, but it is not in itself value-free. There is a value behind the is-ought distinction.
Do you want to come back? Do you want to run this one? Yes.
Yes, I freely accept what John has just said. That if you take the view that there is something purposive in nature, or in the world as we know it, we're part of nature, then you're going to resist the thought that the way the world is not morally determinative. And that's fine. I and many others would take a different view. But I would just want to say very briefly two things on that. One, if we are thinking about the kinds of things that we are going to permit scientists to do, if it ever came to the question of regulation, and we had to pass laws about this kind of thing, then it does become very important. And I think, as in other areas of science, it would be wrong to let particular theological views determine the laws of a country and prohibit such research. But I do take the point that people will have a different point of view about this. But that doesn't mean to say that people with say a purposive objection to the idea that there's nothing wrong with changing human nature will disagree with people like me on all issues. I think we are going to potentially agree in some areas over things to do with justice. But I take the point that it's not straightforward, not widely accepted by everybody, that there is an is-ought distinction. Yes, sorry. My second point would be, even if you want to accept John's point of view, then the question is, what does it mean to be made in God's image? In fact, what is the image of God in which we have been created. And Anders picked up on this point. It says the thing that characterizes us most as a species is our creativeness, our intellect, our ability to reshape ourselves and shape our world. If you look at the way the human race has changed over the centuries, over hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, it's quite obvious that we do that. Our whole world is full of technology and extraordinary invention. So that, if you like, gives some support to the presumption that this is something very essential to human nature, this ability to reshape and mould ourselves. Once you have that presumption, it's more obvious that using, if you like, that vital way of relating to the world is something that is therefore wrong in itself. What we have to ask is, why should we not apply that to human enhancement technologies? So if we accept that it's an important part of human nature to reshape ourselves and the world, and that might be part of what it means to be created in God's image, what's wrong specifically with devoting our abilities to human enhancement? And then I do think we have to look at the particular enhancements we're talking about, and their particular effects on the world in terms of justice, but also the particular effects on individuals and the meaning that they change in people's lives. And that's a discussion that takes us very far away from, the atheist versus the theist. And I think that's where the important discussions lie.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think the panel had a good go, and I'm sure we'll return to these themes as we go through the other questions from the audience and discussion during the course of the afternoon. I'm afraid we're going to remove one mic so we have it for the Q&A time, and then we'll have to pass this one around. If I can make a couple of comments just about this general discussion time. Please do make a point if you wish to make a point. We don't really want speeches this afternoon. We would prefer questions as much as possible, with perhaps a brief point. And please feel free to direct your points or your questions to particular members of the panel if you like, or you could just, as it were, address the panel as a whole, and then we'll pass the mic around and have a discussion. So it's really over to you now for anything that you want to raise. And it doesn't have to be, as long as it's within this framework of enhancement, that's fine. If it's not, the chair will be resistant to questions. So please, in the middle, yes. And then, well, perhaps we'll have a lady on this side first, and that will make passing the mic easier. So, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, first, thank you very much for the discussion. And I was wondering a bit more about the justice, and you mentioned cognitive enhancers, or the IQ issues given to everyone. How would you protect the people that would choose not to get the enhancements? Because then, of course, you're going to have a wide gap in abilities, which could lead to a lot of prejudice in the workforce, in life, those types of issues.
Can we have the mic down? I think probably that's addressed at this end of the table over to Anders or Georgia, who wants to start out. Anders, how are you? Yeah.
Fortunately, I think at least the earlier enhancement we're getting are not going to produce an enormous IQ gap. And it's usually easier to enhance those who are worse off than the better off. So that, but I think there is also an interesting effect that a society that has more smart people, even the less smart people are actually benefiting, because more things are getting invented. We know from various studies that smarter people generally tend to think a bit more long-term and tend to cooperate. So it seems likely that we would actually get a nicer society. The problem is, of course, we don't have a good IQ enhancer. We have very smaller things like attention and memory. So that's where we're going to start. And those are not life-changing. They might be perhaps important to an exam or so. So I think that's where we could start testing it out. I think we're going to have quite a lot of time. In the far future, where we have really powerful enhancement, I think we might actually want to institute laws and help redistribute some of the benefits. But that might be indirect. The Amish people are living a pretty good life inside the United States, although they reject most of the technology that makes their surrounding society possible. And that society also seems to protect them to a large degree.
Georgie, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I think what Anders got to at the end is the most important thing. Clearly at the moment we can't do the kinds of things I was talking about, but the question is, would we be interested as a society in having further research in that area so that it might be possible in the future to have some kind of technology, whether it's pharmacological or genetic, to extraordinarily improve IQ. And the question of justice, I think, was potentially sidestepped by Anders, because he said, well, look, in a society where there are smarter people, everybody benefits, because there's a sense in which we make greater improvements in the environment from which all benefit, and that is true. But it's not true that smarter people are better people. So we might have a better environment, we might have more inventions, there might be, more health provision. All of those things might be in place in a sense that improve anyone's life, general improvers. But it might still be true that if it's subject to choice, there will be a group of people, and we could call them maybe the underclass because they're left behind, and they're left behind because they've chosen not to have enhancers. And that will create quite a division in society. Now we might say, but that's fine, that's their choice. A lot of contemporary theories of justice say we shouldn't really be too concerned from the moral point of view with inequalities that are caused by people's choice. So if these things are freely available, and they're available to anyone who can afford them, or the state pays for them, and people refuse them, well, that's their lookout. But there is a problem with that, and it's that they might have good reason for wanting to refuse them. And if the reason that some people don't refuse them is simply because they feel constrained by this background condition of everybody else taking them, their choice isn't free. So there's a problem of undermining real free choice about the way people live their lives and the people they are, because they can only exercise free choice at the extraordinary cost of being left behind, and the problem of potentially abandoning those people who make that choice. And it's that worries me.
Okay, you can see people have gone away, and then
I'll just
Yes,
I'm less excited by trickle-down theory. The Thatcherite trickle-down, let's make the rich really rich and the poor will be lifted up, is the experience of that as a culture is that we live in greater and greater division, and the poor haven't moved very much at all. The rich have done really rather well in terms of our provision of health as a nation. It's a national health system. It's great to live in Surrey. It's not great to live in the north, because the provision amongst the wealthy you can grab is much, much greater than the provision amongst communities that are less capable of going through. So I'm less sure that trickle-down will happen, that our enhanced, intelligent people will become philanthropists. I'm not convinced.
Sorry, and I would echo that, but also, have you noticed that there is a wonderful, but I'm afraid slightly naive optimism about all these bright people and all the fact that the health benefits, they're going to be improving, they're going to be thinking about the long-term outcomes. And there is this whole techno-optimism. One of the interesting things, it has been suggested by some secular philosophers that the whole Enlightenment optimism view is really a Christian heresy. It's taken the Christian idea of progress and of hope for the future, and it's secularized it. But when it secularized it, it lost the counterbalancing Christian doctrine of the fallen nature of man, of the fact that man was fallen and imperfect. And so, what about the enhanced con men? What about the enhanced terrorists? What about the enhanced marketing people, the advertisers? What about the enhanced arms manufacturers? What about the enhanced bankers? I mean, are we so confident that intelligence is such a wonderful thing, that it brings with it this virtue, this improvement? I personally, coming from a Christian tradition, think that the Christian understanding that human beings are both wonderful and profoundly fallen and potentially very evil is a much more realistic understanding of what it means to be human.
I did say smarter doesn't make better.
Okay, we've got lots of hands. I think Peter in the middle there was next, and then we'll pass it along to Felix.
Can I ask about another issue? A few weeks ago, I was reading that there's been yet another breakthrough in cancer treatment, and also they think they can now inhibit telomere decay, which means that genes won't wear out. And so people, if you believe all that, will soon be able to live for 700 years. My reaction was that I'm very glad that Stalin didn't have that kind of technology. And I would fear that as soon as it gets out, the worst dictators and their cliques will get it first, and it will be a disaster. So what would the panel think about long life enhancement?
And again, yes.
Fortunately, most dictators tend to be removed not by old age, but as we see by people. Actually, being a long-lived dictator might be a bit extra risk, because now you have more time to get ousted. One of the interesting things about life extension is that it also, even though that is one that might have a big social impact, it also, if it takes a while to spread, it still seems to be spread. I did some demographic models, and what really scares me about life extension is that society seems to be assuming, oh, we're going to live a little bit longer, but not a lot longer. So we've been basing our pension systems on that assumption and not really looking at, well, there is a slight risk that we might actually, Aubrey de Grey might be right, that we might be getting very long telomeres in the future and live along. But that's, I think, that's a social problem that it might be tough, but it's worth solving. I think generally life is worth living. And this gets back to, well, are people good or bad? I think on average people are fairly decent. There are some rotten eggs. But on average, enhancement just amplifies what we're doing, so it's going to be more of it. But on average, I think we're pretty good and decent and enjoy life. So that's actually why I think, on average, enhancement works.
I think it's one of those interesting ones, because if it did more than just add a few more years to our lives, so the average life expectancy was no longer 85, it was 100, it wouldn't change the way we understand ourselves a great deal. But if it was much longer, I think it's one of those ones that people worry about, because it's not a way of life that, it's a way of living that we're used to conceiving. Now, of course, that kind of thing would happen over time, so we get used to it. We would have to think about what it would mean to live a life maybe where the average lifespan was 200 years or more. And then we just change the way we think about life. I mean, some people just have miserable lives and miserable attitudes, they're just miserable old buggers or young buggers, a bit like me. You're going to have people like that, but it could be positive. One of the things that people are always told, they have to make choices in life because life's too short for them to do everything they want to do. So if we're talking about 200 plus lifespan, and this is with reasonable health, why wouldn't it enrich people's lives? Because they no longer have to make some of those sharp choices. I've only got 60 working years, I can do A or I can do B. They could do A, B, C and D. Now, why wouldn't that enrich people's lives, except for those people like me who are miserable buggers?
Anyone down here? That's your first.
I mean, there's a few practical issues that come in as soon as you do that. If we raised human lifespan to 200, say, feeding everyone's going to get fun, because you're going to have quite, we're heading towards a human population that is potentially unsustainable with current sort of lifespans. So you've got some major techno issues. It's assuming the technology could, 10, 50, maybe 100-fold increase in human population could come from these sorts of enhanced lifespans. So it's not all in one side in terms of working out how great this world's going to be to live in. I just have a sneaking, maybe I'm just very lazy, but I tend to only do something when there's a deadline.
And I just want to, again, reiterate the sort of the streak of selfishness behind all this. I mean, already the younger generation are saying that the baby boomers, in which I put myself, and many people, as I look across the room, I see all these grey hairs, and all this, of which I include myself, as a recently made emeritus professor. And I think already the next generation are saying that these old people are consuming more than their fair share of the world's resources. I mean, just imagine if we now go, you know, a few of us have managed to get our hands on the telomeres, and now we're going to be 200 years, you know. Just think how our pensions are going to be then, and think how much other people are going to have to care for us. So it's this streak of selfishness, rather asking the question, what can I do for others? What can I do for the common good? Rather than, I want to live forever, and I'm jolly well going to do it.
I'm still thinking of those games of Scrabble at the age of 150. You know, the ones that go on, they really go on a long time. Okay, we have a question. We have lots of hands actually. I don't know where the microphone is, and I want to give some scope. Actually, can we have a question from up here? I just don't want to be unfair to the thing that is spreading the question around. So there's a lady up here. I'll just remember the camera. Let's go around. Thank you very much.
The first thing that was mentioned was about coffee, but I want to point out that an important reason why coffee was accepted was because people realised how much money they could make from trading it. And I'm worried about the fact that any moral debate you could have is completely swallowed up by the interests of companies who could effectively bully governments and people into taking their enhancements. And this already happens, so how would you stop that, if you could?
In here, piece. I think that's for you.
Wow, I'm not only supposed to fix enhancement, I'm also supposed to fix society's interests.
Absolutely.
Well, I think to some degree this is of course about the impotency of ethics in the first place. We have been thinking quite a lot about what we ought to be doing, and we're not very good at doing that, and we have been not very good at doing that for a very long time. However, we find usually as societies various ways of constraining it. Usually we can't get rid of the self-interest motive, but we can channel it in useful ways. So I think we can also find other ways of regulating this interest. For example, consumer choice. Actually, giving enhancement consumers a voice would be very, very useful. Right now, well, you don't have much organizations for people using cosmetics, and there's no coffee drinkers association. But maybe as enhancement become better and actually matter much more, we should not just have a witch enhancer magazine, but actually make sure we get the right consumer information, and that as a feedback. And of course, as a society, we also sometimes say, no, that's gone too far. Let's bully the politicians, to bully the companies to actually do what we like. So I think we can solve that. But yes, there is a risk that there is a lot of money that goes before both common sense and ethics. And we should be aware of that.
Anybody else?
One sentence.
Yeah.
I'm considerably more cynical about the influence of multinational businesses on governments and governments' general willingness to do what people want and what is fair rather than what they want themselves.
Thank you. Note of realism? Anyone notes of realism from?
I'm a kind of happy Luddite, I guess. I can't kind of like Ludd. Ludd gets put down a lot. Ludd's view is he wasn't be sitting here, I think. We can send each other that. So in that, one aspect of what Ludd did was he went to technology and said, I'm not against technology, but what's the evidence that actually we can keep it under control and we're all going to be better at the end of it? And I'm not a massive pro-industry, anti-industry. But I'll tell you what, most of what we do today is because industry has moved along forward, so I don't want to kick it out. How we create regulations within it, I think are interesting, and I think they're at times imperfect. But that's the balance that we live in every time we wander into Tesco's and walk down the street and buy petrol, we get on the train, we get in the car. We live in that environment. There's nothing new about that. It'll just involve an extension enhanced territory in which we're operating the game in. And do we do it imperfectly? Yeah, we do it imperfectly, and we'll carry on doing it imperfectly, I think.
I just love the idea of the Witch Enhancer magazine, isn't that wonderful? Instead of sitting there and reading and deciding which plasma TV to buy, I'm thinking, which memory module should I go for? Which gets the best buy? It's a great vision of the future, but of course, unfortunately, it's got that horrible slight air of realism about it, that in the end it is consumerism. Consumerism is this powerful force, and I think all of us have different ways of saying this. it's an incredibly powerful force. So just imagine how much money you could charge for something that really did improve memory, even by 10%. And therefore the potential manipulative power. Now, it may happen, but I think we do need to therefore have a very realistic understanding of the risks and the need to protect the weak. And particularly in a global sense, that this is, this is not just one nation making these decisions. And perhaps these are going to be some of the biggest challenges facing society in this next, I personally think that potentially this is more threatening than global warming. I mean, global warming is bad enough, but just think of trying to regulate this across the world in a way which is genuinely for social justice and the common good.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go right up here. Please, sir. Yes. Yeah. We have right over there. Yeah.
Thank you. Anders mentioned that we're perhaps not very good at doing the ought. Taking an ethical view of life in society, perhaps an Aristotelian one, we should try and be courageous, we should try and be honourable, we should try and be prudent, etc., etc. It doesn't matter what's on the list. I would be very interested in the panel's speculation, and particularly perhaps Jonathan's, about, well, isn't the virtue, isn't the morality the thing that we should be trying to enhance?
Sure. Well, of course, this has been suggested. I think some interesting papers in the peer-reviewed literature saying that, speculating about technological enhancement, or moral enhancement, and but the interesting twist that came out in the paper was that if there was some machine which made people more virtuous, you can bet your bottom dollar that the virtuous people would want the enhancement and the non-virtuous would not. And so the conclusion of the paper I found absolutely chilling. The conclusion of the paper was, if technological moral enhancement becomes available, it must be made compulsory.
Anders, I think you want to add a point. Say yes. Did you switch it off?
I just muted it.
Oh, okay. Can you switch it back on?
Yeah, there is a very fun paper where we looked at the willingness to enhance different traits. We asked the students about whether if there was a pill to enhance language ability, would you take it? And it turned out that people were most willing to enhance traits that seemed to be peripheral to the core sense of self. So things like being awake and memory, that was something people were quite happy to do. However, only 9% wanted to enhance their kindness. Professor Julian Savulescu over at Oxford, when he heard that from me, he jumped up and said, "They're wrong!" And maybe we are, but people are suspicious about a virtue enhancer. Partially because it looks or sounds a bit too easy, which I think it is. Aristotle had this point about that we train ourselves to be courageous by doing courageous stuff or attempting to be courageous. It's much more than just some kind of general setting. We need various habits and behaviors. And of course, that's not what you can get from an enhancement pill. You can become more alert, perhaps, and focus your attention, but you can't really, for example, become better at math. You actually need to study the mathematics. The pill can't put the equations in your head. So I think one of the interesting challenges is, with enhancement, we actually need to think about how we apply our virtues. After all, it's a bit like solving math problems with a calculator. In the elementary school, you don't want to solve your math problems with calculator because then you won't learn how to do the arithmetic. But when you're doing quantum physics, you shouldn't be bothering about carrying the ones. You should actually be trying to do the physics, and then the math should be done by a calculator. So I hope we can learn how to use enhanced virtues as kind of step ladders to reach even higher shelves of ability.
Okay, please. This way, yeah. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. You're talking about giving a pill to enhance a person. But I'm concerned about at what point do you influence this human being in vitro, before conception, before implanting, and have we the right to enhance other people in this way?
Who wants to go first on that? That was directed to the panel.
I'll start, but I'll want to say something.
This is what we were also
You first. All being very polite
predictably, I'm against it. But I think, again, as technology advances, this is already, in some sense, raising questions. It's now possible by, for instance, using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to identify embryos that carry certain genes which are regarded as deleterious, and then prevent them from selectively remove them from the gene pool. And it's likely that this will become more powerful. And so the risk is that in this wonderful belief we have in our own therapeutic abilities, that we now have extended our therapy to the future generations. And I personally feel that that's very dangerous, because the law of unintended consequences, at the moment the technology is very limited, the number of births that are involved is very limited and so on. But one could conceive, again, and Pete Moore is going to tell me this is just an if, that it might happen, but one could conceive that it would be possible to make this kind of modulation of future generations. So we are now deciding what kind of people we want to have. Another example is where egg donation is now becoming increasingly common, and there's a market value for eggs. And I wonder if you can guess which eggs have the greatest market value. And they come from women who are tall, slim, blonde, intelligent, athletic, and musical. So if you're dark and into chess, you have much less value. So again, we see how consumerism, it's a sort of terrible vision of the future, all these blonde Californians who are all terribly musical, walking down the street. So consumerism is a very powerful force, and do we really think that that's a better way of influencing the next generation compared to the traditional way, which has been ways of education, under the Aristotelian sense of trying to encourage virtues and training and encouraging the next generation in that way? Isn't that a better way of influencing the future generation?
Just a couple of thoughts on that. One, at the moment, where the pre-implantation genetic screening, that sort of thing, we're working on therapy by removal, which is an interesting scientific position to be in. We just remove the embryos you don't like the look of. So that's quite a long way away from any enhancement program. It's much closer to a eugenics type of way of shaping an enhanced society. And that's where we currently are. And we're just getting cleverer at doing that at the moment, which is often an uncomfortable thing to say, but it's the reality of what those techniques are about. The other thing, some of these things are not new. I mean, the idea of moving it to taking a pill to move our next generation on, we focus around the pill. The chance of you having a heart disease and diabetes between the ages of sort of 45, 50 and thereon is most affected by your mother's diet while you were in the womb. And the only thing that beats that is your grandmother's diet while your mother was in the womb. There's a massive research program trying to decode that as a phenomenon at the moment. If you're interested in chasing it, put Barker hypothesis into Google and follow it down. So we are already in a position where we can significantly affect the outcome of our progeny. What we're talking here is whether there's a techno way that we can push that even further. But very often there's nothing new under the sun, and this is one where we're already in that territory to a large extent. And then the question is, how much further do we want to deliberately push that?
Okay. Did you want to add something to this? Yeah.
One of my favorite papers is about giving choline, a vitamin-like substance, to pregnant rat mothers, and it turns out that their pups have got better memory. So this is also a form of enhancement that you could do prenatal. And well, what do you get choline from? Well, in humans we get it in bacon, egg yolk, and sheep chocolate. So pregnant women who eat a lot of that are probably enhancing the kids inadvertently, unless they have read the paper. At which point, of course, they might be deliberately enhancing the kids, which seems to be an interesting ethical question, whether we should start questioning their motivations when they start eating a lot of chocolate. The tricky part about changing future generation is that they don't exist yet. And since that enhancement, if it happens early on, determines to some degree what person eventually emerges. That means that that person can't say, oh, it would have been better if you not enhanced me, because they wouldn't exist. So I think one should rather try to look at, well, does this actually improve the chance of an open life? If you give somebody green skin and wings and a soprano voice, that might limit life choices quite a lot to be an extra in opera. But a lot of its general purpose goods, like a long life, health, intelligence, are actually quite useful for anybody, regardless of whether they want to go into music or accounting. So I think we should be aiming for actually saying that, well, yes, we are modifying future generations, but we should recognize, indeed, that we don't know exactly what we do. So we should be playing it safe and aim for openness, because that's not going to bite us as much as actually aiming for something specific. That's always going to be troublesome at the family dinners of the future.
Yeah, please do, yes.
I agree with what Anders said. But I do think we can make too much of this question of, do we have the right, when you said, do we have the right to decide for somebody else? You're talking specifically about children. It's decisions made by parents are the kinds that select 4 characteristics that will generally increase the opportunities of living a fulfilling life. Can't potentially see the problem. What I wanted to say was that we shouldn't necessarily regard this as consumerism in the way that John suggested. If what we're talking about is parents selecting in general skills, things that, regardless what particular life that child then goes on to choose, will enhance their opportunities and improve their quality of life, that's not an obvious consumerist choice. It's doing good for your child in a way that we can generally understand, where we understand ensuring that your child has a healthy diet, ensuring your child has a reasonable education, is providing those kinds of things. If that's what it's doing, I don't understand why there's a moral objection to doing it through enhancement, rather than waiting until after the child's been born and then, like I said, make sure it has a good diet, make sure it gets music lessons, or whatever. But I don't think the means make a specific difference in themselves, and I think we tend to focus too much on that and regard it as consumerism when it just might be coextensive with all those other things that we accept parents legitimately do.
I think John just wants a quick word on this one before
just a quick point. In many societies in the world, the best thing I could possibly do for my child is to make sure it's a boy, because all the things that are true, that boy will have greater access to work potential, will have much greater openness. So does that mean that the right thing to do, therefore, the moral thing for a parent is to make sure that child is a boy? In other societies, the best thing to do is to make sure that the child doesn't have skin pigmentation. So if I have an opportunity and there have been cases where in vitro fertilization has been used to make sure that a child is created of the desirable race, the race that has the greatest opportunities. So I think that does illustrate how there is a difference between selecting a child whose characteristics are going to give the greatest openness versus trying to give the child that you have the very best, the best opportunities.
Could I, just before we go to the next question, sorry, Peter, do you want to, okay, just going to mention on the genetic note, I think I'm the only geneticist on the panel. I'm not on the panel, but just a little comment, purely for information. But, it's interesting to reflect that if you take something which we know to be very inheritable like height, something simple like height, which is between 70 and 80% inheritable, when you do your genome-wide association study on 180,000 people, as was recently published in Nature, where you just look at all the genetic variants in the whole population of 180,000 people, And you come up, in this case, with conveniently for remembering the number 180 gene variants that are involved or that correlate with differences in height. But then you find actually they only explain 10% of the inheritability. Even though, we know that height is 70 to 80% inheritable. And that's right across the board right now. Genome-wide association studies are showing incredible complexity in inheritance of things, or the number of genes, the number of gene variants that are involved in inheritance. And I just put that into the equation. I mean, I'm not coming down on any particular position, but just the fact that some of the more kind of optimistic ideas about changing our genomes, I think are simply not achievable. I mean, our genomes are so complex, and the whole inheritance question is so complex, they're simply way beyond anywhere where we are at the moment genetically. That was simply a comment on the fact. So can we have a question here? Yes. We'll go over there. Thank you. Yes.
This really is a question to John. You mentioned earlier that we shouldn't try and change things which were species specific, and that we should try and preserve the image of God. What are exactly those attributes? Because, sorry, you mentioned, well, why shouldn't species specific be 250 years as opposed to 100 years? I'm just trying to see what it is you're trying to preserve. There used to be a distinction between restoring the creation, trying to roll back the effects of the fall, which was one of the impulses behind the scientific revolution, and at the same time not trying to enhance the creation. So I understand you in some senses of not wanting to enhance the creation, not wanting to improve on it. But I just want to know what that creation is that you're thinking of.
Thanks, it's a very good question, and of course there isn't a simple answer. But I think there is, until now, until this generation really, we have recognized a common human identity. We recognize it across the human race. We recognize that we are all the same under the skin, whatever our colour, but we also recognize it across history. I was reading the book written by Augustine, in AD 400, something like that. And what was extraordinary was this sense that this long dead human being was able to speak to me, that I was able to follow his own thinking, and in some way his mind and mine met. And this isn't a very carefully and philosophically worked out answer, but it is that recognition of a human identity that spans time and that spans geography, that we are all the same under the skin. And I think that does reflect a Christian understanding that there is something intrinsic within this, and that it's good. I mean, it goes back to in the creation stories that God looks at the creation and says it's good, not it's half-baked, which is that's the narrative that comes from the transhumanist view, that this is just a half-baked beginning. Now we've got hold of the levers, now we're really going to produce something. And there are these two quite different narratives. I can't give you a sort of list and say, this is what's human. But the word I found was species typical. This is typical of what human beings have always been, right into the dawn of history, what we recognize as being the human condition. And one of the interesting things about the Enlightenment techno-optimist, the narrative, is it always sees nature as constraining. Nature is the limitation. Nature is always getting in the way. My dratted sort of the limitations of gravity, the limitations of aging, the limitations of dependence. If only I can burst free. It's got this constant narrative. Whereas in the other understanding, the theistic understanding, nature is actually part of the good. We rejoice in nature rather than constantly seeing it as. And wisdom, virtue, is learning to live within the givenness, the constraints of the natural order. And I still ultimately, although very much that doesn't in any sense say that science technology, progress, medicine, medical care, and so on, is wrong. But fundamentally, within this understanding, there is a wisdom that comes from an acceptance of who we are, and that's good.
Yes.
I'm always so uneasy about the natural order, because that natural order seems to be kind of evolving and changing. And it seems to have involved smallpox viruses, which we got rid of, and I think we all would agree that was a good thing. So it seems that some of these givens we should be struggling again and overcoming. Ignorance, well, that's originally given, but we can overcome that through education. And everybody agrees that is good. So it always seems problematic to make this argument about what we should be preserving in a natural order, because it's not just because it's a natural order, it's something particular about some things and not other things in this order we should be dealing with. But I think there is an important recognition anyway in here, because I think there are two kinds of transhumanists. There are the yes transhumanists, the no transhumanists. And the no transhumanists, I think they are actually wrong. They say no to a lot of the things in the world. They find the world constraining and ugly and strive to struggle against that. Which might work, but it's also psychologically very problematic. The yes transhumanist says, yes, life is good, the world is great, but let's make it better. So I think that's the important difference. I want to live a long life. I want to live a really, really long life because life is so enjoyable. It's not because I'm really afraid of death. If I were really afraid of death, then it would be hopeless to get a long life, because then I would just have more time to worry.
John just said, well, what is it with us? We're always trying to escape the bounds of nature, so we say no to gravity and no to all these other things. And we shouldn't. We should accept the limits of nature. So I think, fine, let's just say no to trying to save premature babies, and no to trying to save people's lives when their hearts stop, and no to providing them with heart transplants and all of those other things. So it's a way of, in a different way, stressing Anders' point. Which of those constraints in nature are we not allowed to say no to, and why? And what distinguishes those from the ones that John would allow us to, and he works in this area, allow us to say no to and try and resist the forces of nature and the constraints? Because clearly we don't think it's always wrong to resist the constraints of nature, where nature is constrained, which it is not.
One more there? Do you have one more there? Yes.
Well, again, the distinction that was mentioned was between restoration, but some sense that an enhancement. That there is a difference. It's interesting, just as an analogy, that art restorers have a code of ethics. When they're working on a masterpiece, they're allowed to use highly sophisticated technology, and they do. They use X-ray diffraction and all sorts of stuff. But ultimately, they are constrained by the artist's original intention. The artist's original intention is normative. So they're not allowed to zap up the Michelangelo by saying, it's jolly dark over here, why don't we sort of make those angels a bit more interesting? Why don't we sort of, we could really do this better. And so the distinction between art restoration and changing the masterpiece, repainting the masterpiece, is there. Now, and I fundamentally, I think, believe that there is power in that distinction. I recognise, so in the care of premature babies, I see this entirely as restorative, that babies are not designed to get catastrophic brain damage, and it's not part of humanity to die within minutes or days of birth. And I'm trying to make them normal, healthy babies. I'm not trying to make them super cherubs of an astonishing. I'm trying to make them normal human beings. And so, to use that analogy, the question is: are we restoring the masterpiece, or are we changing the design? And of course, again, that does bring in a fundamental value system. And I think one of the important questions behind all this is that everybody is coming from somewhere. It's a myth to say that the people who take an enlightenment eschatology about creating the future and so on do not have their own value system, their own beliefs, their own worldviews. Everybody's coming from somewhere, and the challenge we face in a pluralistic society is how do we find a way of agreeing together, often coming from totally different understandings of the way the universe is, of what it means to be human. How do we find and agree among ourselves? Now, most of the time, I don't think the way to do it is through law. It's not by saying, you know, modafinil is illegal, you're not allowed to take this stuff. It's much more about hearts and minds, that's what I'm interested in. It's about giving people a better vision of humanity. What is your vision of humanity? Is it to be super enhanced? Or is it this more ancient vision of being a virtuous person, of being human as you were meant to be, of being fully human?
Question up there, blue slide, please. Yes. Come down here. Yeah.
Hello. So I'm more on the view of John as well, and then to give a bit of a comment on what should we expect from a human being. I guess one answer I just find with some of my friends is that we are basically God's house. So we try to become better with living with one another, so that He can live within us. So this is maybe the religious perspective. But now coming to the other perspective and trying to approach the other points, I would ask the panel, what is your view of what it means to become better? So let's say we take these pills for better memory, more years or so, but what is the ultimate goal? Because, for example, in the last century, we've had many changes in terms of technology and enhancement. Like we got television, then we got computers, now we get Facebook and so on. But I don't believe these are better things for us. And actually many times I discuss with my friends, and they say, look, because of all these enhancements, all the society is becoming more stressful and everything needs to be done quicker. Every time I need to do more things and I'm more stressed, I cannot enjoy life anymore. And the happiest time is when I'm in the mountains or when I'm with my friends and I don't get to do my work. And I'm very much afraid that if we live 200 years, you won't be able to change 3 or 4 jobs as you are saying, but we are actually going to do more things on the same job, and maybe because we'll be like, with the IQ of 250, we'll be doing more, but on the same thing, so it will basically be just more stress over a longer period, not necessarily that I'll be happier or that I'll be enjoying life more.
Peter's holding the mic, so Peter, at the age of 150, are you still going to be happy on Facebook? That's what I want to know. keep going to me now to Sean.
There's times when you wish you weren't holding the microphone. Think fast, think fast. Yeah, I'm part of the problem here we have is at times trying to define the indefinable. And happiness, enhancement, human, they're all pretty indefinable. And we're now trying to have a debate where we work out those 3 indefinable things stacking on top of each other and come up with a concluding point around it. And at that point, my brain's beginning to seize. But I think it points, which I know isn't quite answering your question, but whether what we're talking about is an aspirational debate as to let's play with it aspirationally, or a pragmatic debate as to things that we expect to happen tomorrow. And it comes right in the middle. It would be a great essay question, but I can't take it further at the moment.
Yes, up this way. Yep. Anders, do you want to have a go, or Georgia? Yeah.
My quick answer is kind of evasive, but that is most enhancements work for particular tasks. If I were to take Ritalin, I would be able to focus my attention, which is great for sitting in front of a computer with a paper, but probably not very smart if I'm out on a bike or a car in the traffic. Which there might exist some pills that are good for taking before taking a car, but most likely that's not going to be very good for me concentrating on my paper. I think we need to learn better how to actually use our enhancement. The real problem with television is not television itself, it's that we quite often just use it like everybody else does. I think that is the problem with a lot of consumerism. It's not that we decide what to select, but we just take what everybody else does. And then it doesn't work very well. For example, I'm not on Facebook because I know myself. I know I couldn't stay away. If I joined, I would be checking for updates every minute. I would never get anything done. And I managed to at least that's one small achievement of me staying away from taking Facebook.
Just say no.
Just say no. So I think the real challenge of enhancement, and this is something we probably can't enhance directly, this is something we actually have to do as a kind of virtue, is learn what works when and for what purpose. And do we want the costs for that? And that's going to take a lot of experimentation.
I think it's a short but illuminating answer that we're looking to improve the quality of human life. The interesting thing is where we have the debates like we've been having now as to exactly what that involves. I don't mean the quality of my life or any particular individuals, what kinds of conditions, social conditions, what kinds of enhancements of whatever form would improve the general quality of human life. And I think that's where the argument lies. And that's what people with different values and different intuitions about the value of human life and the meaning of human life are potentially arguing about. And I think that's where we should look. Well, why else would we want to do it? I think everyone's very clear that they're doing it to make life better. But that's really uninformative. The question is, what makes life better? What makes it better?
Indeed. Very brief, because we're going to have time for more questions.
So I think one of the positive things to take out of this, therefore, is that question, what is the good life? It's not a new question. It's been asked right from the Greek philosophers onwards, but it is the vital question. And it's the vital question we all need to ask ourselves, because it's becoming more urgent. It's not just an interesting philosophical speculation. It's something that really is we're going to ask ourselves as a society, what is the good life? What is it to have, in your words, a high quality of life? And I think that's a highly contested discussion, but it isn't necessarily that the good life is brighter, stronger, longer, fitter, more beautiful. The answer, which has come from many different sources, is that the good life is often much more about other things and not our functional abilities.
Good. Okay, I think we have a question on here. We've got 5 more minutes, so please, brief question and then brief answers to the panel. Thank you very much.
In reference to the previous points about taking care of very premature babies, how do you feel about using technology to keep alive 23 or 24-week-old, born at that age, babies, when only a very small fraction of those who are treated and resuscitated survive past childhood, and those who do are often severely disabled?
Question, John, I think. Yes.
Thanks, yes. As you may have seen a television programme recently on BBC Two asking this question, is it worth saving those to 23 weeks? And it's a question I've wrestled with over many years. It's because it's very close to home in my medical practice. And it's not easy to give a very short answer. And there clearly are times, as there always is in medicine, where the right thing to do is to say enough is enough. And that just because we have an ability to the technology doesn't mean that we should use the technology. And the question and the difficulty is to know when is enough, when is the right time to say yes and when is no. But I just would make the point that in all medical care, there is always the possibility of actually ensuring that somebody survives with disability. If tragically you're cycling home after this meeting, you're hit by a car and you're rushed into Adam Brooks with a severe head injury, if you are resuscitated and put in intensive care, there is a significantly high chance that you're going to survive with permanent brain injury. So does that mean that we should stop looking after people with head injuries? Much better to allow them to die, because there's a risk that if we start intensive care, we'll end up with somebody with brain injury. That's not the way we think in most of medicine. Most people, we think, yes, we should give them a chance. Yes, we should do the best. So why should premature babies be any different from any other human beings? The real question is the premature baby a member of a human community who deserves the same kind of care as anybody else? Or are they in some way subhuman? Are they not really quite a citizen? And therefore, they don't have the same kind of rights as anybody else. And that really is at the heart of the approach of any debate.
Now, what I'm going to do now, our time is just about up, and so I haven't told the panel I'm going to do this, but I'm going to give them each maximum 30 seconds to say any final 30 seconds, not more.
Just say no.
To say any final words of wisdom from their perspective they'd like to give. We're going to start here. And as I said, I'm told I'm going to do this. Very, very cruel to end it. There you go, Anders, say.
Well, I think I generally say yes. But, well, I'm from Sweden, I must be laughing a bit. But I think the most important part is, I think enhancement is not necessarily selfish. We can enhance ourselves because we actually can contribute to others. And I think that a lot of people would be very willing to do that.
Thank you. Yes.
Then about wisdom. All I would say is, no matter what your views were before you came, whether we were generally pro or generally anti, or maybe you just had no damned idea. I think the important thing is to think about it and keep an open mind, because it should be apparent that we're talking about a very wide range of things when we talk about enhancements, and we're talking about a very wide range of potential effects. And I don't think there's a simple yes or no to the question of should we allow enhancement. I think it depends entirely on what it is. So I suggest keep an open mind and think about it, because you should do that too.
Good.
And while the mind's open, listen to debates, listen to talks, work out whether people are talking aspirationally or practically. Is this something that is likely to occur in any number of lifetimes, or are we playing a mind game, just trying to think about what the human's like? It's kind of some of the best sci-fi books. You never expect that to happen, but it's a great way of practicing, working out what human is about. In terms of enhancement particularly, you also just ask, is it a social one? Is it a personal one? Is it a species change one? Because if you eliminate that, then you can start to get some more sensible answers out of things. So, will you get a conclusive answer? I'm not sure, but you can at least chase it more powerfully.
I think just to repeat that this is an opportunity for all of us to readdress these age-old questions of what is a good life, what does it mean to be human. A friend of mine is a paediatrician and did a study comparing children with special needs and what was most important in their lives compared with children with normal ability. And it was very interesting finding. She found that children with normal ability would often ask, what's the most important things in life? They would say things like, my PlayStation, my bike, my ability to go cycling. She asked the children with special needs, and she said the most common thing was something like cuddles with my mum, spending time with my family. And she asked the question now, who has a more realistic and a better understanding of what the good life is all about?
Well, thank you very much indeed. I want to thank the audience for some really great questions. I do think we want to really thank the panel very much. It's a very enhanced panel, I have to say. Wonderful contributions. We've worked them very hard. So let's thank our panel.